to roll off my tongue, having spent 32 years at William Mitchell College of Law before we combined. And I wrote an article about Lena Smith about 15 years ago, and it was the product of a solid 5 years of research. And every time I'm asked to speak about her, I have a different lens because her story, I think, can reveal a lot about Minnesota's early civil rights history, what small general practice lawyers can do, how the role of law in defining and enforcing our civil rights norms, and what feisty women in combination with community grassroots organizations, in her case the NAACP and the Urban League, can accomplish over time. I don't pretend that Lena Smith, the state's first African-American woman lawyer, did anything alone. She's really just a symbol and a placeholder for a whole movement of people. But what was unusual about Lena Smith, born in 1885 in Kansas, is that she changed what we now call the narrative. She changed the story about how one could make change. She came of age at a time when blacks in Minnesota often pressured each other to not disrupt things because it was so much worse in so many other places. And so, but Lena Smith said, I am from the West, Kansas, and I am fearless. I don't want to just go along with things the way they are here. We have to take some risks in order to make change. And so her voice was unique at that time, especially for a woman. At the time she graduated from a Mitchell Hamlin predecessor school in 1921, there were no more than 3 African-American women practicing law in the whole United States, as far as we can tell. There were many others preceded her, not many, but at that particular time there were only approximately 3. And so she really was a pioneer. I have some fun, thank you very much, Liz. I have some fun pictures, but I also want to, I was thinking, Evolution of her personal presentation over the decades. At a certain point, her father died and the whole family, mom and kids, moved to Minneapolis. And now Lena is the oldest. Her mother is working as a domestic or taking in laundry and working as a maid. And she's trying to find a way to make a living. And this is a flyer I found in her niece. She never had children, but her family gave me access to some of her papers. She was a reader, a dramatic reader. She can run the gamut from tragedy to comedy. And the picture she's on, your very right, is Lena Smith, dramatic reader. They would go on the Chautauqua. But apparently that wasn't a very good way to make a living, because the next thing we know, she's in embalming school. And I could not find out very much about the Barnes School. This is again in Minneapolis. She's in the class of 1910 and clearly the only woman. There were several other men. It was a ripped photograph. They'd been cropped off. And she appears to be the only person of color in her class. So, but I think she found it difficult to make a living or to get a job as an undertaker's assistant. Back then, people didn't want women. They would hire a woman to be the assistant to the undertaker to take care of women's bodies, but maybe a black woman wasn't allowed. And in the black community, undertaking was one of those jobs that was generally segregated, or the black funeral homes and undertakers had their own business and white, and she didn't find a position. So the next thing we know, in 1913, she started her own hair salon and dermatological. She was a dermatologist and a hairdresser with a Jewish woman partner, Bessie Gesser, and they opened a very well-appointed store on Nicollet Avenue. And how do I know it was well-appointed? Because of the bankruptcy they filed, and thank goodness for court papers. The federal court sent the bankruptcy file, which of course listed all of the velvet upholstery and mahogany fixtures and stained glass lamps in the bankruptcy. This was quite shameful, I believe, because Ms. Gesser took her name, her first name, out of the city directory and moved away for a while, disappeared. But Lena Smith forged on. I'm going to show you, here's a picture of Lena in front of a pyramid of her friends. These just, again, give you a little visual for fun. She had a little sister and one younger sister with 4 brothers in between them, and she spent a lot of time with her sister and made sure, this is on the steps of the high school where she went. But next thing we know, Lena Smith is selling real estate. This is 1915. She declared bankruptcy. She had her hair salon in 13, bankruptcy in 14. Now she's a realtor. And the black newspapers, the Minnesota Historical Society, let me tell you, has a wonderful trove of all of our African American, of all of our historic newspapers, and a lot of this came from them. They were very advertised in stories about our first black woman realtor. Now, the NAACP is founded in 1913 in St. Paul, 1914 in Minneapolis, and she is an early member of the NAACP, and she's selling real estate. So if you know your history, or a little bit of it, you know she's coming right up against race discrimination and racially restricted covenants and other practices in her practice as a realtor. Lo and behold, there's a law school upstairs in the Northwestern building, in the Plymouth building, I'm sorry. It's Northwestern College of Law. And she starts going up 2 flights of stairs every day after work to go to night school at Northwestern College of Law, predecessor school of the school where I teach. And it took 4 years, 5 years for her to get her law degree. But she didn't wait. She's becoming an activist. In 1919, these photographs aren't super high quality. They're taken out of newspapers. This is the Pantages Theater. It had a balcony and a main floor. African Americans were supposed to go upstairs. However, Minnesota had some of the best laws on the books in the United States. And in the 1880s, had passed a public accommodation law. I don't have the exact year, it's in my file back at school, saying it was against the law to discriminate in public accommodation. Well, clearly a movie theater is a public accommodation. So Lena, with 3 men, went to the Pantages and attempted to sit on the main floor. They were thrown out, and they sued the Pantages. What I liked about Lena is she included a count of battery in her lawsuit for breaking the civil rights law, which I think probably means they had to lay hands on her to get her out of there. They won their suit, but the jury only awarded $1 in damages, which was the kind of thing they were up against. Right on the law, clearly it violates Minnesota law to segregate patrons by race, and we're good Minnesotans, we're going to follow the law, but you don't have any damages from it. However, the Pantages did change its practices, so they may have not gotten money, but I don't think that was the point. They got the theater to change its practices, and they got some pretty good publicity in the black newspapers. Very interesting at the time to compare headlines in the African American community newspapers and in the, what I'm going to call the white or the majority newspapers. So that was 1919. She sued the Pantages. She graduated in 1921. Here's her picture. And on June 27th, so she graduated like June 6th, something like that. On June 27th, she sues in Hennepin County, her first lawsuit, 3 weeks out of law school. Now, like I say, she's in 1921, if she's born in 85, she's in her I can't do math in front of a group, but I think she's 36 or 37. And she knows the practices. Well, these are 2 elderly NAACP members who have come to her because when it's time for their contract of deed for the deed to turn over to them, what does the white landowner say? Oh, that wasn't a contract for deed, that was a lease. You were renting. And this case was litigated, and she won because they had put in plumbing, a lot of improvements, and their understanding was supported by their action in how they took care of the house. So she's, her first, this lawsuit was kept in her personal effects. I really looked hard for more of her case files, couldn't find them, and might have had a little bit of a professional responsibility dilemma and teach ethics and confidentiality, but I wasn't worrying about it at this time. But this was a filed suit, and she kept it, so I think that must have meant something to her. And these clients clearly came to her through the NAACP, which is one of the largest grassroots organizations, I think, ever. At this point, people were paying 50 cents a year dues across the country. Lena Smith eventually became an officer on the Legal Redress Committee and then the first woman president of the NAACP in Minneapolis in the 30s. But that wasn't a paid position. That was simply, community organization that she was a part of and suing on behalf of. I think the side effect, the benefit also is lots of business. You complain, you go to the NAACP saying I'm being mistreated, and she's there. You can see from the Gibson Girl days, her look has evolved a bit. This was a newspaper photograph that I also found in her effects portrait that she had taken in a studio. How do you look like a lawyer is something I graduated in 1976 with about 10% women in my class, and we were sort of trying to figure that out too. But the tie, the suit, it's much less of an issue today than it was, has been. Now, Lena opened her own general practice right away, and she's doing criminal defense, divorce, contract suits, family law, I said divorce, general civil practice. But the community has learned to begin to come to her when they have civil rights complaints. And the Hermans, who were the elderly couple who had to sue, that was a pretty traditional approach. But by 1931, when Arthur and Edith Lee buy a home in a white neighborhood, she's chair of the NAACP, and they have done, apparently their deed had a racially restrictive covenant. Now remember, in Minnesota never had ordinances requiring segregation. We were so progressive. But there was a lot of de facto segregation in Minnesota, and there were also racially restrictive covenants put together by neighborhood improvement associations. And when Arthur Lee, who was a World War I veteran and a post office worker, though they wouldn't let him carry mail, he had to work in the mailroom, bought a house, people rioted outside their door for weeks and weeks in the hot July of 1931. Now this is shortly after a man had been killed in Detroit, Otis Sweet. Wasn't killed, it was when Otis Sweet, a doctor, a black doctor, bought a house in what was thought of as a white neighborhood. And the black doctor was prosecuted for causing the death. And the NAACP was very concerned about the situation with riots because it's very fraught. And if somebody gets killed, who's charged? Arthur Lee, and probably not Edith Lee, who bought the house. I found the 5-year-old kindergarten girl, Mary Lee, who was still living when I was doing this research, who said that every night her father's friends from World War I and from the post office came, and they would stay up all night with guns inside the house to protect her and her mom, who would sleep in the basement. And Mary said, I don't think I really understood. It was kind of exciting. But then one day I came home and learned that our dog had been poisoned. So, and black paint was thrown on their house. Her dog was poisoned. And clearly it was very tense. Meanwhile, the police did nothing. This is a photograph. Vendors were coming and selling ice cream every night as they shouted, get out, at the black family who was just trying to exercise their right to own a home. There was a small exhibit at the University Architecture School, and there was a professor there who took this story and got the Arthur and Edith Leaf house in South Minneapolis designated a National Historic Site. And they did a community reconciliation around it, which was really lovely. Here's how Lena Smith came in. First, Arthur and Edith Lee get an American Legion lawyer, a white man, who says, look, take a vacation, just leave town, let's defuse the tension, someone's going to get hurt, give them time to raise money to buy you out. And Arthur and Edith didn't want to move and be bought out. This was the perfect house. It had 2 bedrooms, 1 on the main floor. Mary told me all of that it was just what they were looking for. Then Lena Smith got involved, and she stood on the front steps, said she was going to call out ask the governor to call out the National Guard. She met with the chief of police and the mayor. She spoke to the press. She had Arthur Lee speaking to the press. He said, when I was fighting in the trenches in France, nobody told me I didn't belong there. What is this? I don't belong here now. As we know, after World War I, there was a lot of backlash against African Americans who had fought and thought, well, now I'll get some respect. But they basically shamed the chief of police. It was Governor Floyd Olson who backed her up. They didn't have to call out the National Guard once the chief of police started doing his job, and the crowds dispersed. I could talk a long time about this one, but this is an example, no lawsuit, but political organizing, and here's why Lena, the American Legion lawyer, Mr. Mag, M-A-A-G, said, just let them buy you out. But she had been involved in housing segregation battles since the 20s, for the last 10 years. And the narrative in the newspaper was always, they're just moving in here to make money. So they know that we're going to buy them out. They're just holding us up. And that's the only reason they're doing it. Blaming, not understanding the motivation, the right to own a home was turned around into, this is just a tactic for some other kind of advantage. So to say, no, we're not going to let you buy us out, was a political tactic to raise up the idea that this is about the right to own a home, not to make money, the counter narrative for the neighbors. Because it was considered very logical. Even in 1955, there was a survey, and 60% of Minneapolis residents believed that it was natural for black people to live separately in separate neighborhoods than white people. That this was the natural order of things, and of course they would understand that the property values would go lower and people wanted to be with their own kind, even though it was against the law to segregate officially. It wasn't until 1948 in Shelley versus Kramer that the United States Supreme Court said, our courts can't be involved in enforcing these private agreements. That is sufficient state action. So it wasn't until 48 that those clauses became unenforceable. Now, she was also involved in anti-hate speech. And she brought an injunction, a TRO, against the showing of Birth of a Nation in 1940. Birth of a Nation was, I think, first produced in 1915 or very early in the teens and was shown. And there was a lot of violence against the black community when it first was shown. And while today I would say, of course you're not going to get a TRO against the showing of a movie because it's our understanding of free speech. At the time she got a TRO and the mayor backed it, they tried to pressure the theater owner, but they didn't get an injunction. But they got front page news. This is the spokesman, but I believe it was in the Star Tribune as well. About the racist hate speech. They didn't use the term hate speech, but saying it was an anti-Negro film. This is 1940, and one of my slides that I just worked on this morning that somehow didn't get saved onto my flash drive was a slide about police brutality. So all of the same issues that we're still dealing with today, it was a front page story showing the face of Curtis Jordan, an African-American man who had been so badly beaten that his face was puffed up and his eyes closed, 1937. And Lena Smith got involved in that by defending him, going to the jail, and bringing 50 witnesses from the NAACP who had seen 2 off-duty officers beat him up while the officers were drunk, within an inch of his life, or he wasn't, very badly beaten. And she got the case dismissed, but because Curtis, I have some correspondence, because he wasn't the perfect plaintiff, they did not sue for damages for his personal injury. Because he also had a drinking problem, Curtis Jordan, and because they thought that to litigate against the police, you really needed a poster man, not with all the problems that he had. He lost his job by being in jail because not only did they beat him, they put him in jail. But the charges were dropped. The 2 police officers were dismissed. That was a huge victory. So she's not suing for damages. She's not litigating in the courts. She's defending in the courts. She's using the press and organizing the neighborhood. When you bring 50 witnesses to a preliminary hearing, that's a show and an organization. That was in 1937. Brutal attack by Mill City Police stirs entire city. But 1933, severe beating by police ends in death of man. There's a lot in the 30s is where I particularly got a lot of police brutality headlines in the black newspapers of unprovoked assault or black man drinking with white women. Watch out. I want to save some time for questions at the end. Now this is Lena in the 1960s. She mellowed and softened a little bit, no more tie, but she always wore very tailored suits, no jewelry. She never married, and she supported her mother and younger brothers who, one of her early cases was the criminal defense of her 3rd brother in the murder charge. He murdered her 2nd brother in an argument over money, and the only witness was her mother.
Now, I wouldn't take that case. It's sort of like operating on your own child or sibling. You don't do that. You have somebody else. I don't think they had a lot of other options. She got a hung jury in the defense of her younger brother, even though her older brother had died from the gunshot wound to the stomach. And her mother took the stand. The hung jury, the prosecutor declined to recharge, but that younger brother, who wasn't acquitted but not convicted, moved to California, which is where I moved to California for 10 years, so that always sort of cracked me up. Who goes to California? And she was a very skilled advocate. Criminal defense is one of the things that she raised a lot of the race claims. If the prosecutor raised a lot of racist rhetoric in their argument to the jury, she would make a motion to dismiss and lose, but she would raise it. I found cases where she sued the FBI for defamation on behalf of a woman who had been called a bitch by a cop in front of her neighbors. So that's an odd kind of a case. A federal court case, because it's a federal FBI officer looking for a fugitive. A woman talks on the porch to him, and he calls her a bitch. There may have been a racial epithet in there as well. And he sues her, and Lena Smith sues for defamation. You're not likely going to have a whole ton of damages out of this. And in fact, the case was dismissed, and I believe probably settled. Oh, I know what it was, sorry. The officer moved to dismiss, saying immunity because it was in the course of his duties, and she won the motion to dismiss, and then the case settles. I don't know for how much, but the point is she's calling the police and the FBI on their behavior. I interviewed an older woman who had been arrested and told me that she went to talk to Lena Smith about, had been falsely arrested and detained and humiliated. There had been some shoplifting, and the suspect was a black woman, but she was short and fat and dark-skinned. And this woman I was talking to was tall, freckled, light-skinned, and thin. And Lena Smith counseled her, you have a good lawsuit. We won't get much money, but I'm willing to sue the Minneapolis police. And she wanted to, but her father, the young woman's father, owned a restaurant and said, if we sue the police, they'll shut me down. So she did not. It was one of those little windows into what kind of counseling a lawyer did with a client, what kind of tactics. So she would sue not only for the end result, but for the process and the publicity and the pushing back to say, this is enough, no more. It wasn't until 1953, I said that in 1948 the Supreme Court said you can no longer enforce racially restricted covenants, but Minnesota didn't change their statutes prohibiting discrimination in housing until 1953, when race and color were added. Interestingly, the Jewish community had organized and included it. You cannot discriminate based on religion. In 1919, the Jewish Anti-Defamation League had organized and succeeded in doing that, but they did not include, and this isn't on the Jewish community, but it was not included to race or color. That wasn't added until 1953. As a Minnesotan, I was taught Minnesota history mandatory in 5th grade, and I believed that we had a much better reality here on civil rights than many other places. When I went to the Library of Congress to look at the NAACP files, the librarians of Congress said, oh my goodness, the Minnesota boxes? We didn't think there was even a need for an NAACP in Minnesota. Nobody has ever looked at those boxes before. But that's where I first saw a postcard of the lynching in Duluth in 1920, when the 3 circus roustabouts were hung from a lamppost who hadn't been convicted of anything but were ripped from the jail. It's where I saw many of the complaints. This was NAACP correspondence between the Minnesota branches in Duluth, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the national office in New York City. And the idea that we were better, or that we didn't have slavery, or that there wasn't the same kind of discrimination and segregation here. It may have been smaller because our population of people of color was smaller. And I'm not even getting into the Native American history of our state, though my colleague Colette Littell was on public radio with Carrie Miller this morning giving some context about that. But Lena Smith used the law in all these many ways without litigating a whole ton of cases, but using pressure and the law and publicity and the grassroots group of the NAACP bringing 50 people to testify about the beating and police brutality. She also was advocating at the time for mass demonstrations. A lecture in very, I'm sure in her navy blue suit, is mass demonstration advisable? And she was taking the pro, this is in the early 50s, she was taking the pro and everybody else was taking the con. It wasn't until 1964, the March on Washington, was that 63 or 64? 64, that the NAACP and others finally decided that mass demonstrations were necessary. But I think of her as a kind of a visionary. Everybody thought mass demonstrations were too strident. There'd be too much backlash. I can't double guess that, but I've come to sort of trust Lena Smith's instincts on things, that being accommodating won't get us very far. It will only be used against us later when they say the only reason you did this was to get money or whatever. I could pause here and see if there are any questions about what she did. Justice Littlehill.
That Birth of the Nation lawsuit is quite interesting. It looks from the date 9 years after Muir versus Minnesota, which generally dealt with prior restraints. What kind of theory did what kind of constitutional theory did she have?
It wasn't a very good one, but it was enough to, the immediate harm. And you know what, I could pull out the complaint and send it to you, Justice, because I don't think it was, and I don't have it in front of me here, but I think it was, this is going to harm the citizenry so much that it justifies prior restraint. And she didn't argue even why it was constitutional. As it was basically an immediate harm, an immediate threat, including what happened the first time it was shown. Some testimony about that. But I'd be happy to dig that up and take another look. And I have a treasure trove of some of these materials that I painstakingly assembled with the help of law students, of course, and the Minnesota Historical Society. She wasn't an appellate lawyer or even a constitutional lawyer, except that at a time when people didn't think the Constitution included that due process didn't include equal rights or equal access for women or for people of color. She believed in the Constitution, but she wasn't a great theorist, and who even knows if she knew all the case law. She was a community lawyer who made a living, and she died in 1966. They went and found her because she was expected in court on a divorce. She's 81 years old, and she was dead of a heart attack. We're assuming a heart attack. I don't think they did any official inquest. 81 is pretty good long life. Her brothers were never able to find steady employment. No one ever married except her youngest sister. And her youngest sister married and had 2 children. And one of them, his wife, was my primary informer because everybody had gone. It wasn't, but one of her brothers was murdered by the other. One of them was kind of mentally ill and in California. One of them ran with the railroad. The family didn't know about this murder story. They just knew that Preston Prentice had been sent to California and had suffered in the war from shell shock. So he had been, the 2 brothers, one who shot the other, had been in World War I as well, and they explained his behavior in part to what we would today call post-traumatic stress disorder, or, they called shell shock, or the niece had heard something about him being gassed. So some disease is based on battlefield. World War I was horrible in the fields, in those trenches. So her mother lived with her until her mother died, and she supported this clan. She continued to recite the quality of mercy is not strange from Merchant of Venice as Portia, that she had learned as a dramatic reader. She played the piano. She went to the races in Chicago for fun. She got out the vote. She was big on voting and worked in the Urban League. She was invited to President Johnson's inauguration, and because she was friends with Hubert Humphrey as a Minneapolis leader of the communities of color, and Humphrey, she was very proud of that she was invited to LBJ's inauguration. But was somewhat stern and removed kind of figure, even as she was a pretty feisty activist. Ms. Judge Jessup.
And what do you know about her acceptance by the legal profession? I would just think about how hard that must have been, especially in those early years before she made friends like us.
I think that it was tough. I think that she wasn't a super, her pleadings weren't beautiful. I mean, David asked about her legal theories. Her pleading, and I looked at some of them, and there are some grammatical errors. But that's a little different. I think, and C. Paul Jones said to me once that her leadership wasn't in, as much as a lawyer. But she was bar committee, chair on bar committees in the 50s and 60s. But I think she was solo, not by choice, but by, there was no one around who had her same sensibilities and who would take her in. But I don't know of any stories of her. She wasn't one to ask very much, beg or, and she was involved in the Settlement House movement, Phyllis Wheatley House. So she was very socially engaged, and I'm sure that brought her work. But I don't think she was, until the 50s, really accepted very much as a lawyer.
I wondered, when you were doing your research, if you discovered anything about her admittance to law school, if there was difficulty for her being admitted, because being African American and being a woman?
Well, 1921, I think that battle over women was some years earlier than that in Minnesota and nationally. Myra Bradwell was national. Who was the first woman lawyer in Minnesota? Someone help me out here.
Dorset? Was her last name Dorset?
Dorset. And decades before. What's hard is figuring out who's female. I had a research student go through the cards of bar registration, and she used L.O. Smith. You know, finding what someone's gender by their name was hard because so many women in particular used their initials, and Lena Smith a lot used L.O. Smith. I can't help but think that in partly to hide the fact of her gender so people wouldn't stop at that fact. And verifying exact numbers of women in the profession is a somewhat dicey business, in part because of how people use their names. This is a part of the Constitution of Minnesota that I really like because even though it's been interpreted not as broadly as I would interpret it, to obtain justice freely and without purchase, completely without denial, promptly and without delay, I think we interpret it to mean you can't accept bribe. You know, you shouldn't be bribed to get justice. But there's an underlying thinking here too that when we have to have money to get justice, it's not a good system. And as someone who at the law school works with many people who can't purchase justice or who don't have the means to even begin to purchase justice, it's something that we need to figure out how to ameliorate as we go forward. We've been working on this for years. As an activist, small firm attorney, though, I think she's a really, who in her close work with community groups, I think makes her emblematic of a creative, dynamic approach to problem solving and to enforcing civil rights and developing new norms for civil rights, whether it's being thrown out of the Pantages for trying to sit on the first floor and getting them to I mean, that's kind of civil disobedience, or trying to stop the birth of the nation, which is very harmful, even though she doesn't have very solid legal legs to stand on, or facing off the crowds that are demonstrating in front of the Lee's house. I don't know what and getting the governor to talk to the police chief to get them to enforce peace and order. That's all pretty creative, good lawyering that isn't necessarily dependent on, that never would have made it into the appellate courts at that time. Or they didn't have the capital, the money to take it to the appellate courts. Her bread and butter was criminal defense, divorces, and those kinds of, and real estate causes. Any other questions? I think that Ms. Rappi put the link to my piece. There's a lot of work and research left to be done in this area of Minnesota's civil rights history. William Green is somebody at Augsburg who has done some good work who I'm talking with. And there's a project at Augsburg where they're trying to map all of the racially restrictive covenants in Minneapolis. And they have it's a Historiopolis website that is
taking these historic documents to show where Black people and others were allowed to live and where there were racially restrictive covenants. It's very interesting. They want to map the entire city. It's ambitious, and I commend it at historiopolis.org, and they have a Facebook page, and if you want to help them, there's lots of digging to be done. Thank you.